Hello there, watching the press preview. A first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what is making the headlines with Christopher Hope and Moya Lothian-Mclean, both with us from now until just before midnight. Welcome to both of you. Hello. As ever, though, let's take a first look at the newspapers. Tomorrow's Guardian leading with the headline, Tory privatisation linked to increase in NHS death rates. Oh, sorry, apologies, that was the Metro, wasn't it? There is the Guardian for you. The Financial Times, high inflation will persist in the UK. Bailey warns, that is the front page of the FT. And you can't bank that here, mate. The Sun leads with a story on a rocket crash landing on the moon. Clearly, there are more newspapers coming in, a bit late with the tennis. By scanning the QR code, though, quick reminder, you can see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. So let's bring in our guests then. And certainly, let's start with the Metro, Christopher. What we saw at NATO today, I mean, it felt seismic, didn't it? Some real changes in tone and ambition.
Totally. And if you think where we were in this whole defence discussion as late as last November, when the government was talking about the idea of cyber battles and cyber war, that's where it was all fought. And suddenly, post the Ukraine invasion by Russia, we're seeing headlines in the Metro. This is the big paper read by commuters across the country. Europe's new Iron Curtain. US promises 100,000 troops on Russian border. I mean, you know, this is like a kind of flashback for many of us. I'm maybe even including you in that conversation, Anna, back to the 80s here, when I remember vividly that the threat from Russia. I mean, it is absolutely extraordinary. And I think NATO is stepping up. It shows how Biden, how Putin has miscalculated in terms of not seeing how united Europe would be. I was struck by an interview tonight on the ITV's Peston programme, talking about John Bolton, the former US National Security Advisor. And he's saying that actually Russia is winning. If you take an actual zero-sum game here, they have gained territory. Therefore, Russia is winning. And he's saying that outside of where we judge Russia in the West, in Europe, we might think they are completely persona non grata. There's an economic war being waged against Russia. But elsewhere, China, India, other countries are less judgmental of Russia. So arguably, in some quarters,
apologies, Christopher, I think you've frozen. We'll see if we can re-establish what you're saying there. Moya, certainly President Putin has been speaking, quoted by the IFAX news agency and others, and specifically on those points that Christopher was raising, saying that Russian troops are advancing in Ukraine, they're reaching their objectives. He says the ultimate goal is liberating Donbass and getting security guarantees. And he says the goals of the special military operation in Ukraine, as they call it, are unchanged, but there can be different tactics. There's no use setting an end date to the special military operation. And then it goes on to talk about the impact of Finland and Sweden joining NATO as well, and clearly taken very, very seriously, in fact, by President Putin. But how do you see, you know, this Western alliance, if I can put it that way, shaping up as we move forward?
Well, I mean, as Christopher put it, I don't think that Putin miscalculated in the sense that he knew the West would be uniting against him. That was always part of the calculations in order to sort of, you know, make Russia look like they're being victimized by the West. That's been one of the classic propaganda tactics that Putin has pursued in making Russia look like they're this big power that the West wants to crush and oppress, and, you know, they're just fighting for their freedom. I think where Putin really miscalculated was in perhaps the sort of sanctions the West would place, how far they would go, and also in how quickly the war would be won. He thought that it would be a very quick shock and awe, that they could conquer the entirety of Ukraine in a very small amount of time. We saw that with the assault on Kiev and the capital. And now, when that has failed, what we're left with is this horrible war of attrition. So while Russia is making these gains in, you know, the eastern regions and the separatist regions in particular, they're coming with a really, really high price for both Ukrainians and Russian troops. It's this horrendous sort of field of suffering that we're seeing on the battlefield. And Putin thought it would be over immediately, and it's not been. So what he's saying in that speech, where, you know, we won't put an end date on these special operations, is that I can go as long as I want. But from inside Russia, perhaps there are already murmurings inside the Kremlin that top-ranking officials are not prepared to go as long as Putin might want. And if he finds if he drags out this war even further, then he could find his sort of all-encompassing position and tight iron grip on the nation loosening, whether he likes it or not.
Yes, and what was the price he says that he needs to be supported in this? Was it $5 billion a month, Christopher? And certainly the leaders having a dinner tonight, preceded by a live concert performed by the Kiev Symphony Orchestra, which has been in exile because of the war. So it's all related back to this, this extraordinary event that we've witnessed this year with the horror that we've been witnessing in real time, effectively. The question is, are there splits? How much money do we want to put towards this? How much are we willing to suffer the aftershocks, the inflation, the energy, the food prices going on? So how long will the support continue?
Well, that's right. It's very, and there are concerns already about some EU nations maybe less keen to maintain the pressure on Russia, and particularly as we go into the winter and energy becomes a big debate again. I'm really struck by the quote there from the Polish Deputy Foreign Minister on the front page there. He said there that something that seemed impossible to many is becoming a fact today. We have a permanent US presence in Poland, and it's a clear signal to Moscow. We really are going back, aren't we, to this idea of a new Iron Curtain descending over Europe.
Yeah, I mean, that is a great headline from the Metro. The FT pictures President Erdogan, President Biden of Turkey and the US respectively. The US has been stressing that Washington had not offered Turkey anything to win Ankara's backing for expansion prompted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, namely Finland and Sweden, as we discussed. But the move appeared, the paper says, to help the atmosphere between the countries. So we'll leave NATO for now, as I said, the summit continuing. Moya, let's go to The Guardian, shall we? Their headline, the privatisation of NHS care, accelerated by Tory reforms a decade ago, has corresponded with a decline in quality and significantly increased rates of death from treatable causes. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, so this is a study, an analysis actually by Oxford University that has been published in the Lancet Public Health Journal. And it's basically looking at a positive correlation that is found between the sort of privatisation, the selling off of contracts within our health service, and an increase in mortality rate and deaths from, as you put it, treatable causes. Now, this is something that has been talked about, I think, at length by commentators, people within the healthcare system alike. We've seen that in recent years, particularly sort of like the NHS backlog, we've seen a breakup of services. But this is the first study of its kind that links these explicitly with evidence that this is connected to the privatisation of the NHS and those individual contacts, and treating the NHS as if it is a marketplace or a business where health contracts are there to make money rather than provide a service for universal healthcare for all.
Yes, they pick out the Health Secretary at the time, Andrew Lansley. We remember it being controversial at the time, but some of these processes were started, were they not, by Tony Blair, actually, Christopher? And how do we know it is the privatisation or the fact of austerity, which some might argue left health and social care specifically with smaller levels of funding?
Well, that's right. Moya may not want to remember that, but certainly the idea of privatisation started under Labour and I think declined under the coalition. I think from memory, I need to check my detail there, but certainly was a Labour idea and carried on by the Tories to a lesser extent. Yeah, I mean, people can make a political point out of this if they want. Austerity may be a factor, obesity, other key factors. I'm trying to get to what the government say in response to this. I'm also struck by how difficult it is since the Lansley reforms back in 2012 for health ministers and health secretary to have control over the NHS. One advisor was telling me tonight how they view the NHS, it's like a franchise. It's a brand you're in charge of, but in fact, it's being run by all these CCGs, these commissioning groups, and that's part of the problem. So the government gets blamed for stuff, Tory privatisation linked to increasing the NHS death rates as a Guardian headline. But of course, actually, some of it, there are other factors in play here. And I do think, though, the changes brought in by Lansley mean there was a lot less control over what's going on for ministers than they want.
Moya, very quickly, you want to come back, I think.
I think it is absolutely a political point. And I think of course we have to link this to Tony Blair and the sell-off of PPI contracts. It's been successive governments. Tory privatisation has increased, but we can look at New Labour and say that they also brought this in. And that across the political spectrum, there has been a privatisation of the NHS that has adversely affected care. And now we have a backlog of 6.5 million patients waiting for care, and these discussions about further outsourcing that. Now we know that that is not benefiting them, and we have to look at completely restructuring the NHS and bringing it back into that public ownership.
OK. Stay there, both of you. Plenty more still to discuss. Christopher wanted to come back in and no doubt disagree, but we have to move on. Apologies. Sadikanu, unhappy tennis news from Wimbledon, talking about that and plenty more after this break. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me now, Christopher Hope and Moya Lothian-Mclean. Welcome back to both of you. Let's go to a story on the front page of the Daily Mail, which is just in, about Meghan bullying allegations. The story being that an investigation into the handling of bullying allegations made against the Duchess of Sussex has seen HR policies improve for royal staff, but the changes have not been made public, which leads to that word buried in the Daily Mail. Who wants to kick off with this one? Put your hand up.
I can.
That was Christopher, by the way. Crack on.
Yeah, I mean, Meghan bullying inquiry buried. I mean, we love the royal family. We think they're marvellous, the Queen particularly. But there is this degree of need for secrecy, I think, which can damage it. You saw that in your reporting earlier about this issue of the money taken by Prince Charles some many years ago. No wrongdoing, and it won't happen again. That the Prince Charles's team say today. But I didn't know why burying helps. You have got people here who fear they were bullied, gave evidence to an internal inquiry with a former employer, or even, and then they found out this inquiry won't be published. I mean, whose interest is being served here? Certainly not those who are being bullied. I think being more open about stuff always better for any big institution, not least the royal family. This is a great shame.
Well, a senior palace source, as quoted by news agencies tonight, cited the confidentiality of those who had taken part in the independent review as the reason why details were not released. So we'll see what comes out of that overnight and into tomorrow. In the meantime, let's go, Moya, to the Financial Times with the news that the UK is ready to cut gas supplies to Europe. This is a really small story on the front page, on the in the right-hand column there. What we don't know is if it's the gas supplies that the UK takes in because it's got the ports to do so, or if it's our North Sea gas supplies. But this just shows the positioning of nations looking ahead to the winter with a great deal of nervousness.
Yes, of course. I mean, the details on this are limited at the moment, but either way, what we've got in the UK is an energy crisis. And we know that coming up to the winter, the energy prices are set to skyrocket unless there are proper caps put on them by the government, or the cost or the inflation is absorbed by the companies themselves. And we're seeing here these sort of like pre-warnings, these difficult decisions that will be made in the upcoming months, already sort of foreshadowed, so that a populace is getting used to them ahead of time. The question is, how much can we cushion the sort of landing that we're preparing for people so that they are shielded from the worst effects of, the upheaval in gas supplies?
But the problem here is what are called interconnectors between Great Britain and the continent of Europe. And often the gas will just flow through these connectors backwards and forwards to where the price is more expensive. And what National Grid is saying here is they are going to cut off gas pipelines to the Netherlands and Belgium under emergency measures if Russia's invasion of Ukraine puts pressure on supplies this autumn and winter. And this goes back really to the UK government's short-sighted decision to cut storage capacity. We used to have a lot of capacity to store gas, and that meant you could level out the price more and make sure the price wasn't so move around so much. Well, that's changed, and this is slightly alarming, because if this happened on the continent against Britain, we'd be complaining about it. There's a degree of energy nationalism here, which is quite unpleasant, and I would worry about this. If the EU do it to us, there could be problems.
Yes, indeed. So we were going to talk about Emma Raducanu, Andy Murray, both out of Wimbledon. You'll see the pictures on all of the front pages, certainly the Metro with Raducanu, but we will talk about that more, no doubt, next time. Both of you, thank you both very much indeed. Christopher, Moya, thank you. And both of them back with us for the top of the 11 right through. Now, though, let's look at the weather.